I think on social media, there's always this temptation to make things seem more glamorous than they really are. And on the flip side, as a consumer of social media, it's always easy to take things at face value just as they're presented, without ever thinking about any of the things that go on behind the scenes. And I've told you guys this before, where it seems like, social media is a way for people to kind of put together their highlight reels and only show the good things and never any of the bad or the true costs of what goes on behind the scenes. And this even applies to me, and I just want to remind you guys that I'm no different. And what really got me thinking about this week was when I put up the video from last week about surprising my brother with a car. I received this comment talking about how I live in Southern California and have an NSX and a Supra and a Land Cruiser and all that is cheap, and for sure that I'm making bank whatever it is that I do. So I thought it was funny, and I replied stating that this was only possible because I still live with my parents. And even though it was a somewhat funny reply, it's very true, and it got me reflecting that the parts of my life that you guys see really is just a small snippet, and you guys aren't really getting the full picture of what goes on behind the scenes. And so it's easy to think, just make bank, drive nice cars, life's good. That is just not reality, and the bigger picture truth behind the scenes, it's just really not that pretty. I mean, think about how many times you guys have heard about examples of people where it looks like on the surface their life is perfectly put together, but behind the scenes down the road you find out later that they were actually drowning in debt. Or examples of people with huge homes and nice cars, everything that you could dream that they could have, but then you find out that if they've maxed out their credit cards, or people who seem to have picture perfect relationships, they're always together, always lovey-dovey, always happy, but then down the road you find out that they actually got divorced. This whole social media thing, the YouTube, the Instagrams, the Facebooks, they just exacerbate this idea of keeping up with the Joneses. And to an incredibly extreme degree, because everybody wants to appear like they're living their best life, and oftentimes you don't even get a glimpse of what's going on beneath the surface until it's too late and you find out that things weren't even close to what they seem to be. I mean, take me as an example. In my past videos about the Supra, I've received so many comments talking about how expensive the car is, how much money I've spent on it, how I must be rich because I'm able to afford it and also afford all those mods. The truth is, when I first started working in 2008, I was making $75,000 a year, and I spent $33,000 buying that car financed. I bought a car that was over half of my annual gross income, which I couldn't even afford right out because I didn't have the money, so I went and got a loan from the bank that I had to pay off over 6 years in order to pay for that thing. And the story doesn't even end there. Halfway through that loan, I actually refinanced the equity that I had in the car in order to pay for mods. I took out another loan against the value that I already built up by paying off part of that loan, and I borrowed more money in order to pay for the mods that went to make the car fast. And so in total, I spent over $70,000 on that car just so I could go play Fast and Furious. And if you guys have watched that video, you'll know that it was a never-ending cycle of constant modifications, paying more money, taking it to the shop, breaking, doing it all over again. It was never-ending. And so behind the scenes, no one even knew this, but this car that I owned was actually owned by the bank, and it took me a total of 7.5 years to pay off that car that I bought in 2010. And the grand total for the car, including all of the repairs and the mods, totaled up to over double what the car was originally worth when I paid for it in 2010. But wait, the story doesn't even end there. It actually even gets worse. Back when I first started working, instead of helping my parents with the bills, helping them pay off their mortgage, which we're still paying for now, there was so much that I could have done with this new job and this new money that I started receiving. But instead of going to help my parents, instead of going to help pay for the things that I needed to pay for, I took it all and spent every single dollar that I made towards this car. I wasn't trying to save for a house. I wasn't trying to invest any of it. I was spending every single dollar that I took home towards this car. Now, thankfully, I did have the foresight to max out my 401k contributions, but there was so much more that I could have been doing with that money. And it seriously pains me so much to think how much I could have helped my parents, how much I could have saved, how much I could have invested over those years. I mean, just to torture myself a little bit more, I went and calculated how much that would have been if I had taken all that money that I spent into the car and just invested it in an S&P 500 index, which is what most of my portfolio is now. I would have had an additional $282,000 in my portfolio. And that is one expensive Supra. And not even to mention, during that time period, I wasn't paying for rent, I wasn't paying for groceries. Sure, I would give my parents, a couple dollars at a time and, pay for something like the cell phone bill, which is tiny. But for me to think back now and to think that I, as a fresh newly graduated 21-year-old was making more money than both of my parents combined had ever made in their entire life, and I was taking every single dollar that I was taking home and spending it all towards this car that sat in the garage that I played Fast and Furious with. It just pains me to think about. And on top of that, my parents being the awesome and loving and supportive individuals they were, they never forced me to pay bills, they never forced me to pay rent. They never said, now that you're grown and you have a job, now's the time to start paying us back for all the years that we invested in you. No, instead, they just let me do my thing. They let me go my own way, let me learn my own lessons, let me spend my money how I wanted, and that's how I spent a lot of my money for the first 6 or 7 years that I had a job. And so exactly like what I was saying, in front of the camera it was all glamorous. I had this fast car, I had this nice life, everything was cool. But here I was behind the scenes, mid-20s, working a pretty high-paying job, not helping my parents at all, not investing any of that money, not paying off any of my debt fast enough, and instead refinancing against that thing that I owned to pay for more mods for that thing. And I just happened to be lucky that I picked a vehicle that didn't lose its value entirely. Whereas if I had gone another way and picked something more common, like a Infiniti G37, I could have very easily lost out on all the money that I put into the car. At least with what I chose, I happened to luck out, and now I have a car that has risen somewhat in value, so I haven't entirely lost every single dollar that I put into that thing. But if I had just very easily gone a different way, all that money that I put into this vehicle, it could have just all vanished. And so it was really lesson learned the hard way. I'm so thankful for my parents for supporting me, for always standing behind me with my decisions and letting me do what I wanted to do. But the fact is, I was here with a job that made more than they had ever made combined, and I wasn't doing a single thing to help them. And laying it out that way, I cannot help but think that this is the furthest thing from glamorous. This is not glamorous at all. Of course, I had, social media, putting pictures of the car up. I had videos. That YouTube video has like 1 million views or something like that. But behind the scenes, I had so little money saved. I wasn't helping my parents, and I was in debt. I had not paid off that car throughout the time period that I was making those videos and going to those races. Now, thankfully, since then, I've wised up and I've learned a little bit. I opened a Roth IRA a couple years after working, about 5 or 6 years in, which I should have started way earlier. I started setting aside pieces of each paycheck towards a savings account, starting to try to save and start to try to be more responsible with my money. And then eventually I started taking over the mortgage payments. I started paying for the taxes. I started doing more to help my parents. But again, in the very beginning, for those first couple of years, I wasn't doing a single thing to help them. And again, it's only sheer luck that over the past decade or so that, I've been working, that, the value of the car that I bought has gone up. The stock market has gone up. So my investments since then have gone up as well. But to think that those first couple of years, just how much I squandered what I was given, there was so much more that I could have shown for it. And I like to think that, well, at least I learned my lesson, but the truth is, I haven't even fully learned that lesson. When it came to the purchase of the NSX, which is only like 3 years ago or so now, it wasn't all that different. Yes, at that point, I had been starting to save, I had been more responsible, paying for the mortgage, helping my parents, actually paying for groceries. I had an emergency fund, that I was starting to grow. I had paid off the Supra finally. And so because of that, I was feeling kind of good about myself. And so again, lesson learned? No, obviously not. This NSX came along, and I still remember looking at that post. It was way out of what I could afford. And again, what does afford even really mean to you guys? I think a lot of us, me especially, have to get out of the mindset of thinking that afford means that you can afford to make the monthly payments on something. And that's a tactic that used car salesmen love to pull, because if you can just make the monthly payments on something and make it from month to month, paycheck to paycheck, then that means that you're good and you can afford it. I'm trying really hard these days to get out of that mindset, because just because you can make it from month to month does not mean that you can afford whatever it is that you're paying for. And so you'd think that I had learned that lesson by that point. This was only like 2.5, 3 years ago. But nope, I didn't learn that lesson either. The NSX came along, and guess what? I financed, again, 95% of the purchase price of that car. I took out a loan that was over $50,000. I took out a loan where my monthly payment was over $1,100 a month, so I could again get this car and go play Fast and Furious. And yes, although I was making it and affording it month to month, being able to pay the mortgage here, being able to pay for the groceries, the cell phone bill, and also make the monthly payments on the NSX, no, I can't say that I was able to afford it and that I wasn't stretched thin. And then to add on top of that, the only reason that I could be able to pay for all these different things is, again, one, because I still lived at home. I didn't own a home. home. I wasn't planning on saving for a home. There were no plans on building any sort of personal wealth. Yes, I was putting money into my 401k and I was maxing that out and I was maxing out my Roth IRA, but you know, those really should largely be considered the bare minimum. And one of the things that I wanted to start doing from all these lessons that I learned was, I know that a lot of you viewers out there from looking at my analytics are between, 25 to 34 is what I see, mainly male. I'm making videos for myself. I am my demographic. I really want to start making videos about lessons that I've learned so I can help you guys not fall into the traps that I fell into. And so now for the NSX, it's again, really not that glamorous. Behind the scenes, I'm still making payments on that thing and I still have about a year and a half to go until that thing is fully paid off. And reflecting on it, it's just so funny. Like, the NSX actually it exactly represents everything that I'm talking about in this video. You see, the thing with the NSX is it was such an impulsive purchase. I actually bought that thing sight unseen. It was actually in Minnesota. I bought that thing sight unseen. I had a guy go out and look at it for me, and then I purchased that thing without even flying out to look at it. And you know what? On the post, it was great. In the pictures, it was great. When it showed up on the transport truck and showed up in front of my house, everything was great. I looked it over. It was amazing. The paint was immaculate. It was beautiful. Really, and on the surface, it was everything that my dream NSX could be. Everything about it was perfect. The color was perfect, the paint was perfect, the mods, the wheels, everything about it was absolutely perfect. But just like what I'm saying in this video, behind the scenes, underneath the surface, things are not always what they seem. And you see, the fact is, the longer that I've owned it, the more that I've realized there are so many issues with this car that I bought sight unseen. In fact, knowing everything that I know about this car now, I would dare say that I actually overpaid for this vehicle. I mean, major things that do not immediately appear but are underneath the surface, things include this car has an accident history. I knew about that, but I chose to ignore it. It hasn't had its routine maintenance done. Things like timing belt, water pump, those haven't been done in over 15 years. And in the time I've owned it, I've discovered more things that are wrong with it. The carpet is some ridiculously poor quality aftermarket red carpet that's ripped up in multiple places. It's missing a whole bunch of parts underneath the carpet because of an audio system that used to be there that's no longer there. The electronic steering rack pulses and probably needs to be rebuilt soon. Valve covers, the cam covers, they all leak. The car has a bad ABS pump, and that's why the ABS light is always on. For some reason, the thing barely passes smog. The radio doesn't work, which is why it's removed, and none of the speakers are installed in the car. And so this car is a reflection, an exact reflection of what I'm talking about in this video. From a 10-foot, 5-foot level, this car looks great, but get underneath the surface, get behind the scenes, and you'll realize things are not what they seem. And so to close this video, I just want to leave you guys with this lesson that I've learned. See, some of these lessons that we learn are extremely painful. I look back on myself and I think about all the mistakes that I made. I'm just so utterly ashamed and embarrassed. But the fact that we've learned them and we're able to reflect on them, really take those lessons, take those mistakes, and apply those lessons. And if you haven't made those mistakes yourself, really look to others that have made those mistakes, that are telling you advice that you need to pay attention to, and try your best to not make the same mistakes too. Use those experiences of others, use the experience that I'm sharing with you guys, and try your best to not live beyond your means. And take everything you see with a grain of salt, because truly you never know what is going on behind the scenes, and things are not what they seem to be.